So Ryan, you have this incredible podcast and you and I connected and wanted to have you on to talk about this. It's called the Exorcist Files. And I know there's a pretty incredible story about how this came to be, but this is a show that really digs into some of these incredibly disturbing but also enlightening cases of spiritual warfare, possession, all sorts of different cases that you get into. What in the world possessed you to want to create this podcast?
Was that pun intended?
It was.
I figured. Okay. Well, this has been a head spinning process, as I do say.
Was
Um,
that pun intended?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, I, like probably most of Americans, just admit to having a fascination with just the spiritual. And I originally was researching the topic of miracles. I've always been fascinated by claims of the miraculous, anything that sort of violates the natural law. It makes life more interesting, right? I confess I don't want to live in a world where I have everything figured out. It's always fun to hear the stories, and half of Americans believe they've seen a ghost or believe in ghosts. It's really interesting. So okay, something there's enough around the world to suggest that something's going on. I was actually researching miracles, and I went out to the Vatican, and I think it was late 2018. Was really blessed to have some people who were knew a lot of folks there, and we got connected and had a lot of really interesting conversations. And it became of interest to us that we could actually connect with someone, and we were offered a chance to connect with someone who really was sort of one of the leading authorities on spiritual warfare and exorcism in the church. And when I was offered that introduction, after petitioning them, saying, "Look, I would actually love to do sort of a journalistic take on this," they said, "There's one person you need to talk to, and it's Father Carlos Martins." So I gave him a call and said, "Do you want to do a show with me?" And he's like, "No." And so, of course, you learn as a producer that word. You're like, "Okay, well, let's keep talking." And again, he's one thing I really appreciate about Father is, this is not something that he wants to draw a lot of attention to. This is not a spotlight thing, or his own ministry. And it took a lot of convincing, but finally I said, "Look, Father, you have these incredible stories and you have these principles and teachings that you've dedicated your life to using to help set people free. Why don't we share that with the world? I think it would be a fascinating experience." And he said, "Okay." And so that was really awesome. And so we started working together, and actually we started shopping around as a TV show first. And we had so much interest, so many companies talking with us. And then this little thing called COVID hit. And like everything, it killed COVID Dream Slayer, and essentially, became really unfeasible to try and get a bunch of priests in a room to start, recording this. So we actually had to put it on hold for a while, like everyone had to put a lot of their stuff on hold. And then, really cool, a friend of mine just happened to be praying one day and said, "Hey, I feel that you are supposed to connect with this person." And of course, I'm always open to that. And if someone, calls me and says, "Sure," I'm like, "Why not? I'm going to meet a new friend." I met this person, and they actually referred me to iHeartRadio, who immediately took an interest, saw the vision for the project, and said, "Look, if you want to do this as a podcast in the way you want, with dramatic reenactments, 3D binaural, we're down to do that with you and partner with you." And it moved along really quickly. And now we have a amazing podcast that by the time this airs should be at about 1 million downloads, which is pretty cool.
That's incredible. I mean, there's such a level of interest in this topic, and it's something I've encountered, working on Playing with Fire and, telling these stories. I love seeing you dive into this. It's also something that needs to be done the right way, right? I mean, you're dealing with something that is very real, and it's something that really scares a lot of people. And so I guess let me go there for a minute, because you dove into this, right? You had a plan. The plan turned out a little differently than you thought. You ended up with this, incredible podcast. How did you deal? And maybe you didn't have the fear, but how did you deal with maybe that uncertainty about the topic, or the fact that maybe it could be a little unsettling to dive into it? What was that like for you?
Yeah, so I mean, I will concede. Look, a lot of what we talk about to probably the average person, I get it. This sounds completely bonkers. I mean, this violates every sense of normalcy. There is no study. I cannot show you any peer-reviewed research on demons or entities or spirits. I mean, it is you share these stories, and there are usually two reactions. Half your friends think that you've lost it, and they're like, "Really?" In fact, someone the other day, I'm on a few boards of some startups, and I guess they were showing a a deck that had my picture on it. And someone in the audience, my friend texted me and said, "Hey, someone recognized you." Said, "Hey, I know that guy. That's the demon guy." And I said, "I don't want that to be my branding going forward, but
You are the
nonetheless,
demon guy.
I
I
don't
like it. Okay.
I don't need to change my Instagram handle anytime soon." And so I recognize that there is just a sense of ridiculousness when doing this. On the other hand, you also get a lot of free meals, and a lot of people, you can dine out on a lot of the stories. So it never fails for the question to be posed to me: tell us a crazy story of something. And then inevitably it is followed up with, and do you actually believe it happened? So I think part of what you're confronted with, one of the strangest things about doing the show is you are basically, yes, you are taking someone at their word. You're taking a priest, which, of all different types of folks, like I tend to trust a man who has given his life to the church. And I mean, this is not someone living in a 9-bedroom mansion in Beverly Hills, right? This is someone who lives in a religious community and is just this quietly gone about this ministry. And so there's something I found deeply credible about Father Martin's and his stories and the way he tells his stories. And so of course you sit down with him for the first time and you say, "All right, tell me one. What do you got?" And he goes in, after hearing about possessed 9-year-olds, Ouija boards, truck drivers, witches, curses, levitation and objects, you go, okay, there's at the very least there's stories here. But I so I when I again, there's a reason that shows and films about exorcism and horror are perennial bestsellers and commercially viable. Even people who are not religious are fascinated with this topic, for better or worse, probably worse. The world is obsessed with just the spiritual, and there's a lot of interest in the occult side. In fact, I don't know the numbers today because the study I saw was from 2012, but it was interesting. Despite a rapid rise in secularization in America and I think a gradual loss of religious belief in the country, belief in the possibility of people being demonically possessed has actually stayed pretty high and is, I think, roughly around 65% among young people. So there's this weird dissonance where don't really believe in traditional religion, but the spiritual belief in the idea that people could be demonically harassed, actually quite a few people believe that's possible. I think that is probably due to anecdotal just experience. A lot of people may not subscribe to traditional religion, but they have a friend or someone they know who said, "Look, don't mess with this. I can tell you there's some weird stuff out there." So I think there's a humility in just saying, "Look, we don't have all the answers," but there is a fascination with horror. And so I wanted to get in and really, I'm not a journalist, but sort of take that approach and say, okay, there's a lot of claims about this stuff. Let's parse fact from fiction here. Let's find out, what is actually going on. And you dive into it and you discover there's a robust theology, a framework, and there's a lot of misconceptions about spiritual warfare that, a lot of us just get our images from the films, which is basically, a priest and a demon shouting at each other, and who can shout the loudest at the end of an hour and a half wins. And that's not at all what happens. So I wanted to just expose, and then also sincerely, if someone was experiencing a haunting or whatever, if someone genuinely felt that they had something going on in their lives that there was no physical explanation for, and they couldn't find help, it's sort of like Ghostbusters. I was like, who are you going to call? So I wanted to give people a resource if that was actually happening to them.
Well, it is really interesting because as culture secularizes, as you were saying, we're so obsessed with the material. There are a lot of people who they have these experiences and they're completely competent, not crazy people, right? As you were saying, almost half the public says that they believe it's possible to at least have ghosts, and we could have a whole conversation about what ghosts are and if they're real or not. But the point is, there's something going on there, and we see this going back to the beginning of human history. This is one of those issues that has been with us throughout all cultures, throughout all societies. And so it's intriguing, though, because these people today, they're seeing or experiencing things and they don't have anybody to talk to about it. And so I've had people reach out to me. I'm sure you've had this too, with their stories, asking for help, saying, where do I go? And that was really eye-opening to me because having grown up, in the church personally, it wasn't something that we talked about a lot at church. Yeah, we talked about evil, but we didn't really get into what do you do if you're really confronted with that evil. And so, how has this for you, because now you've looked at this, you've done tons of interviews, you're putting this show together, you're looking at his case files, right? How has this changed your concept or maybe refined your concept of evil as you've gone through this process?
I mean, it's interesting. It hasn't changed too much in the fact that I have always subscribed to the fact that I think there is just evil in the world. I think there's objective evil, not cultural relevance, not differing value sets, but there are things. I've always believed this. There are things that are just fundamentally evil, and I think if we really search our hearts, we know a lot of what those things are. And so, just formalizing and saying, yeah, there is stuff that, and again, there is a lot that's hype. There's a lot of things that you could be unnecessarily scared by, but the reality is there is you. If you turn on the news, and if you really were, I mean, true crime is one of the most popular mediums on podcasting. Categorically, it eclipses so many other things. And if you just were to do a random sampling of true crime on podcasts, I mean, there's no shortage of grisly, disturbed, horrible things that go on. So evil's real, and I think I want that to be established. Like there is such a thing as evil that's out there. But it's interesting. I've always held to this belief that there's more going on. Sort of, I love the Matrix, and I think that there's something that when Neo knows that there's something amiss and he can't quite put his finger, like he says, like Morpheus said, a splinter in your mind, right? That something is not as it should be. Now, part of that was cultivated when I just would ask lots of people, to your point, credible, smart, non hyperbolic individuals who would tell me, everyone, I'm generalizing here, but so many of them had stories, just stories about, tell me something spiritual, tell me something spooky that happened. I have another podcast called I Went Camping where we interview celebrities, and I ask all of them, do you have a ghost story? The amount of or a spooky story, the amount of people who have just a little interaction or something, even if they don't subscribe to a religious worldview, so many people have at least one story that they're like, man, I cannot explain what happened there. So I think the clues are all around us, and then interviewing Father and his stories have just led me to firm up my belief that there is more going on. And I won't even take the stance of I can explain everything that's going on. And sure, some things can be coincidental. There are things that we attribute spiritual causes to that are surely just coincidental. But on a lot of these things, you go, wow, okay, I don't know of another explanation. And this is a little different, but if the US government can't explain fully what some of these UFOs are in their reports, right? And maybe they are weapons, maybe they are, there are things that even at the highest levels of government, we cannot identify what's going on. Maybe one day we will. So I like to say that, I'm 90% sure I know what's going on, but totally. We could just be in a simulation. Maybe Elon Musk has us all in a simulation and I'm just playing right into his hand. I don't know. Maybe they're people have asked me, do you think they're just interdimensional beings that have appeared? Are they aliens? Maybe. Like there's a lot of stuff I can't explain. There is no double blind, peer reviewed, meta analysis of spiritual appearances, right? That I understand that the argument here is trust me, just, take me at my word, what's going on here. But when you add up the sheer number of people that have claimed to experience something like this, people who have, are really smart and not, and are of sound mind, I think it's pretty compelling. I think there's compelling evidence for the plausibility of these things existing.
Right. And, obviously, you're working with a priest on this from a Christian perspective. Christians are going to say, look, the Bible says this and this is what's there. That, though, is not going to appease a non-believer or somebody who doesn't look to the Bible as having authority. That's not going to give you the peer-reviewed studies you're talking about. What I have found really interesting about this is when you start to bring in, and we've done this on this podcast, when you start to bring in somebody who talks about being in witchcraft, they talk about interacting with spirit guides who they thought were being helpful, and they tell you this whole story that sounds so bizarre that, again, people would look at and say, okay, that's crazy. And then you start pulling in their family members and the people who also saw these things, and you start to get this narrative around this story that at the very least, anybody who's being fair and looking at it is going to say, something is going on there. Like clearly they've all experienced something collectively. It's not just this one person. They've all seen this. That became very eye-opening, for me as just somebody who I'm a Christian. I'm an evangelical Christian. I have been my whole life, but I'm also a person who wants to be proven that things are true. So you have to give me details and facts. My go-to is going to be prove to me that's true. Okay, but you're telling me this. What about that? I know you play that role a lot in this show as well. In your show here, kind of being that sort of check on what is going on. Has there been any story for you, though, that you've encountered where it's actually really hard? It feels like a slam dunk, even for you to find maybe those loopholes that you could pinpoint,
Oh, I mean, a slam dunk is in like this is airtight, like this,
or almost as airtight as it could be. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the challenges when doing a show like this is you can't. Yeah, yeah. So I want to. There's a couple things about exorcism, and one of the things that I really enjoyed about this show is dispelling misconceptions and myths about it. So the first question that anyone should ask, I asked, etc., is like basically, show me the tapes. It's like talking to Nixon. Like, why'd you bring? Why didn't you burn the? Where are the tapes? And so right off the bat, right, the Catholic Church does not allow recording in these sessions. And at first you go, it sounds like a cop out. You're like, come on, we've had audio technology for what, 130 years to record. We couldn't at least get, just for the edification of the believer, we couldn't get one tape. But if you take a step back and you go, imagine someone recording your deepest, most vulnerable therapy sessions. Now take that and imagine that you were actually experiencing some of these manifestations and you started rolling around on the floor doing unspeakably horrible, grotesque. I mean, because if these things are real, their entire design is to try and subjugate, humiliate, and basically just punish humanity for being
Destroy, even. I mean,
destroy
yeah.
humanity and humiliate it, right? So if humanity is made in the image of God, these things just seek to just totally mock that, right? So imagine the most horrible things ever, right? And imagine there's a tape of that and it got leaked to the press, right? I mean, just imagine what that could do to you, to the memory of you, etc. I mean, it is just, I understand. Like, if you really do that thought exercise, I do understand as well why, like, it seems convenient there are no tapes. So that
And
is
do they want to be exposed? I mean, there's a whole other element of, and people can have this debate, but are they going to perform in those moments when you are recording, or are they going to hide out? I mean, that's a whole other
well,
theological conversation.
you bring up a great point there too, which is like, it is arrogant for us to presuppose that anything that we are testing is going to automatically play by our scientific experimentation
Right.
rules, right? And again, I know it sounds crazy, but if there were some sort of entity, right? Forget angels, demons, whatever. Say there was a sentient, immaterial being that we were trying to evaluate, right? If it was sentient and it was alive and conscious, right, and aware of our intentions to study it, there is no guarantee that it would play by the rules. And if you talk to, and I've talked to many priests and many people in this space who have observations about technology being manipulated, tapes being gone. This won't convince anyone, but one of the first interviews we did with Father, and we double back up everything, was completely erased, like just vanished off the hard drive, right? I smile at that and I go, that was my introduction to this. Now he, of course, is like, well, that's not too interesting. And I thought, well, that is interesting. So, you bring up a good point there. And so as far as an airtight case, etc., I think for me, what ultimately, like anything with faith in general, right, is over time you test and you get a reaction, you test, you get a reaction, and you eventually learn, okay, these are the inputs to the world, and this is how the world works. And I have heard, even when I was in college, long before I was involved in this, 10, 12 years ago, um, I had several friends in college, independent of each other, tell me stories about these immaterial shadow figures that would appear in their room and would actually try and at night jump on top of them and get them to submit. And from two people, this is interesting. I have heard that same experience from probably 9 to 10 people, and the description of the being is the same. In fact, I heard one as recently as 2 weeks ago. And so when I hear about a shared experience from people who I can attest, these were not people who were on any sort of drugs, they were not, crazy. This is something that, like, I have heard about. And you look at, to your point earlier, the vast majority of cultures on earth have a prescription for how to deal with evil spirits. So this is something that has been time honored throughout history. And even with the advancement of technology, it still continues to this day. And I always like to put myself in the shoes of, okay, you can say, man, I think all this is just hogwash. But the reality is, you're in the minority. You're in the minority. 93% of the world claims to have some spiritual paradigm, right? And you go, okay, sure, take half of that. We don't know what that actually means to have that. But even then, you're looking at over a billion people, right, who have some paradigm for this. So to completely dismiss everyone and everyone's experience, I mean, for the Christian listeners, You can go read like the Diary of John Wesley or the early church fathers, right? And it is a fascinating exercise. He goes through, like, woke up, had breakfast, did some ministry, met up with Charles, did some deliverance, cast out the demon who knew I was coming 2 miles away. I mean, reads just matter of fact. Or St. Augustine, right? City of God, not a beach read, not a page turner, right? City of God, about 2/3 of the way through, he is rebuking several people saying, hey, remember when we saw these tumors disappear in front of our eyes? You should go tell people that. And I don't have time to tell you all the other miracles that happened. Let's move on to other stuff. I mean, you read about all these things, and the idea that every single person is wrong, that there's no evidence, that's
Yeah.
just, I don't buy that.
Well, the other thing too, it's like we can sit here because you and I have had the same, pushback from people. This is crazy. This seems weird. Oh my gosh. I mean, somebody even today tweeted at me, "Are you serious?" Because I was asking about Ouija board stories. I'm like, hey, who has a story? I'm not saying I'm going to believe the story, but I'm a big believer in hearing people's stories, right? I don't have to agree or think they're true, but I'm open to hearing it, and then I want to try to prove that what you're telling me is accurate, right? But when you look at this, it's also kind of crazy that you and I right now are sitting here staring at each other, having a conversation across the country, that we are able to think and process and believe in these incredible bodies. I'm looking outside at a tree and flowers and all these other things that seem like works of art that are magnificent and amazing. And we're on this giant ball floating around in the universe. I mean, all of these things actually seem pretty incredible. Everyday life does, right? So there's so much we don't know. Again, I have my Christian lens through which I believe this is true, and I believe that the way that the Bible describes it is accurate. Even within that, there's a lot of mystery. There's a lot that we don't know. I've talked about this on the show, but you meet all these people who Jesus is healing in scripture, and you don't know how they got in that state, how they got in that, possessed state, right? We don't know what brought them there. And so there's so much to unpack here. What has been for you, because you went into this obviously with a worldview understanding, you knew about it, your perspective on evil didn't change radically as a result, but was there anything you found surprising or enlightening that maybe you didn't know before getting into this?
Yeah. So I think, one, I really grew in appreciation and respect for a lot of Catholic doctrines that, even though I don't particularly subscribe to, I just really working with this priest. And again, you can point to every single faith having some bad apples. But this just, I really learned to appreciate some of the intellectual consistency, because one thing that really drives me nuts is when different factions of Christianity just blast each other as the Antichrist. And I just, and I think something that Catholics and Protestants would agree on is that Jesus wanted a unified church. Now, what that church is, right? That's the debate. But I have really grown in appreciation for the convergence of Protestant and Catholic theology on this issue. That is something that I found very fascinating, in that you can substitute words: deliverance, exorcism, right? Rights, strongholds, permissions. I mean, there's so much convergence there, because the reality is that everyone starts with the premise on this, that these sort of demonic harassments that we chronicle in the show are major exorcisms. Like, these are cases that are what would be considered major possessions, things that I wouldn't want to go deal with like individually. These are things that are like extreme cases, right? So in those cases, right, they're a little more exceptional. But for the reality is, the vast majority of people are not under possession. Demonic possession is extremely rare, and I was surprised to find the agreement on that, even among the priests. Like, yeah, it's very, very rare. The only
Yeah.
reason they have so much work to do is because there's so many people, but it's very rare. The Catholic Church is actually extremely rigorous in trying to rule out medical causes first. So we actually have on our show a very prominent psychiatrist, Dr. Richard Gallagher, Ivy League educated, teaches at Columbia, and mental health expert, just through the roof, incredible mind. And he's called in on many cases to say, look, hey, let's rule out first mental health causes. So for a lot of people to say, oh, it's just mental health, like, they screen for that. And the vast majority of the time, they're not doing anything, especially in the States, unless there's mental health professionals involved, et cetera. So I do appreciate that they assume physical causes first in that. So for some listeners who are like, oh, I just want to dismiss this all as a mental health crisis, Dr. Gallagher has a funny line. He's like, when one of your patients suddenly starts speaking Aramaic fluently, you go, I'm going to potentially rule out maybe mental health causes. My mentally ill patients typically don't learn foreign languages in 48 hours, right? Or they just picked it up. So I have learned to appreciate that. And then also just the idea that you're not supposed to have demons. And if you do, it's only because some doorway or permission was open. And you don't have to be Christian to subscribe to that. There are many spiritual frameworks that involve, hey, entities need permissions or rights. If you look into the stuff on ghosts, there is a permission theology that is there, like an idea that they have to be allowed there. And the idea is that in any sort of exorcism, the drama is to remove those rights. And lastly, for those who, might, again, the Catholic Church, I found there's an immense deal of respect and deference to their process, because, they put down in a formal rite at a time when everyone was just, trying to figure out what to do. Was it like 500-600 years ago? They're the first ones actually put together, hey, here's a guide. And I know we had talked briefly about this earlier. The rite of exorcism, every exorcist has their own flair. I've learned that they have their own prayers. There is not a formal exact order it has to be done. Every exorcist will put their own unique flair and style into it, but the process is still the same. As you're not supposed to have demons. If you do, find out what doorways were there, and then this is more sad than it is interesting, but something that I've really had to try and wrap my mind around is that in most cases, especially the cases we profile, it's direct
Yeah.
interaction with the occult, right? Direct, relationship with that sort of stuff, which then the skeptic could argue, well, they were already predispositioned to dealing with supernatural. The cases that really stick with you that are really interesting are when there seems to be either no overt issue or something that everyone dabbles in, right? Like we have a case coming out about a girl whose father abandoned her, right? Or generational, when someone in their family line had trauma and had nothing to do with that individual. Those are the cases where you go, okay, I don't understand this, and that doesn't make sense. But the reality is, according to the Christian framework, if the general population of God's children can be held accountable for the sin of Adam, there is this framework that somehow these things
Right.
be passed on. And that sucks, if these things are real, the fact that they can capitalize on trauma done to people that was not of their own volition, that bothers you and it sticks with you. But the cool thing is in this show is, for those who are like, I don't want to listen, it's a little scary. Just know that the vast majority of cases, they end well. In fact, you cannot go through a situation like that and have experienced those manifestations and not walk out with a different worldview.
Yeah, and I think that is something that everybody I have profiled and talked to, they tend to be people who have become Christians throughout the process. As a result of the process, they, and it's interesting to me because there's a broader debate too, right? Like, can you expel a demon without Jesus, right? That's from the Christian framework, the answer would technically be no, that you would need Christ to do that. And that's probably a totally different conversation. We could talk about it, but I don't want to forget about this thing you just said, because it's interesting. You talked about the doorways that are open, the direct things that people do. I know you cover Ouija boards on the show, which, a lot of people, they look at Ouija boards as though they're just toys. It's this fun Hasbro board game that everybody's just pulling out and having a great time with. But when you dig into the history of the Ouija board, it's actually a very eerie and bizarre history. And I know that you've looked at that. When I looked at it, I was actually blown away by it because I didn't know much about it. So going into it and researching it, I came away, and you can comment on that in a minute, but I wanted to say this, we're watching culture right now, young people in particular. I was just looking at some data. About half of young people between the ages, I think, of 13 and 29, I forget the exact age range, but that's about the right age range, are using crystals. They're using Ouija boards. They're using tarot cards. They're engaged in this on a weekly basis. That's actually, to me, a very alarming statistic in light of what we're talking about here. I don't know if you want to reflect on that at all.
Yeah, I mean, it's one, again, just from a purely academic standpoint, given what I've learned, or experienced in this, I just wouldn't want to roll the dice, right? It sounds crazy, but it's like, I mean, you ask yourself, like, what do you gain from the Ouija board, right? You're like, okay, I gain a night of recreation. But I mean, I have friends who, like, it's funny, after we just put out a Ouija board episode, and the number of people that have come to me and said, have I told you my Ouija board story? I mean, it's now, again, I think my co-producer did a wonderful job of helping us include there is some actual research and science done into it, right? Which is the idea that you might know things that are stored at the involuntary muscle spasms may reveal, even if consciously there's a block. So there is totally science to explain plausibly why people feel the planchette is moving without their knowledge, right? That auto suggestion and ideomotor phenomena happening is totally a real thing, right? But I mean, again, we'll find out once the medical reports come out. But in the last 6 months, there have been 2 cases of young people hospitalized in Colombia after playing with a Ouija board, right? And in one of the cases, it was declared there was no toxicity. So we're like, okay, we'll have to find out what's going on there. At least there's something happening in that part of the world. But it's funny. I obviously, the sources on the Ouija board lore. There is some, obviously we weren't there, and you're going off these third-hand accounts, but I do encourage everyone. Like, there's a guy we quoted from extensively named Robert Murch, who is a historian on this, and
Yes. Yeah.
if half of what happened is true, I mean, it is just enough to give one pause. I mean, the founder of one of the main medium who helped name the board, um,
Helen Peters.
Ellen Peters, ends her life by saying the board lies. Don't use it, right? I mean, the other guy who helped take the board and commercialize it, sort of the Steve Jobs, if you will, of the Ouija board, right, is told, and we actually left this out, and I meant to put this in, is that the board allegedly told him, prepare for big business, right? So he starts building this office, etc. He's up there leaning against a flagpole. It snaps. He falls off a roof, grabs onto a windowsill, and like a scene out of Final Destination, the windowsill closes. He plummets, miraculously survives, gets into a carriage to be transported to a hospital, and then goes over a bump, and one of his fractured bones pierces his heart, and he dies. And you go,
So I found his obituary in the New York Times. I was able to dig that up, and I will tell you, it is fascinating, right? Because you're right. Some of it is not like we can't know for sure if the board told him to build the building, right? But we know he did die after falling off of that building. So it is remarkable. You have to look at it and say, okay, what is going on here? Because I expected to find a story that was much more benign, right? Like, okay, there's nothing here, right? The fact he fell off the building alone trying to fix a flag is actually eerie enough on its own. But we have to have facts and details and verify things. But I find the story bizarre in light of what the Ouija board is. And the fact, you walk into a bookstore today. I was at a bookstore the other day. I walked in, and I kid you not, like the right-hand side, before I even got in the store, it was witchcraft. It was, I mean, like literally you're walking in, and so where I am in New York, that is a big thing. Like, my kid is 10 years old. A lot of her friends, they're wearing crystals, they're doing witchcraft. I mean, this is just something that is kind of so embedded. And so if it is true, and is, like you said, it sounds crazy, but if it is true that these are doorways, which I personally believe they are, that's incredibly disturbing to watch more young people being sort of pushed into that normative experience that isn't really all that normative.
yeah, and there is, I guess the silver lining of this too is, right, is that there's just an innate fascination with spirituality at the human condition, right? I mean, so one of the things that like that kind of led me to be open to all this is that, you know, I think most humans look at each other and they say, look, they recognize there is more than just flesh and blood there, that we are mind, body, and soul, right? I mean, because even people who don't believe in a religious framework, right? I mean, they experience love. They know, like, they look at their spouse and they say, look, I don't, when the spouse says, I love you, I don't think, no one is overtly thinking, wow, I mean, can you imagine if your spouse said, this collection of chemical secretions and hormone reactions in my mind leads me to believe I'm experiencing that sentiment known as love? Like, no, we believe that there are these immaterial truths like love and justice. And so everyone's walking around borrowing these virtues and these truths from some, standard that we get it from. And so I think that, I love the fascination with spiritual. Where it gets interesting is that, humans also always desire to usurp spiritual power and use it for their own gains. But it's interesting because there's such a fascination with like different cultures and the spiritual paradigms. I mean, even just look at the Force in Star Wars, right? Like, there is a deep fascination with this, and at the broken side, it's so we can, I would love to be able to move rocks like Skywalker, etc., right? But it points towards a deeper hunger for truth, and so I think that it is important to, advise and warn our young people about, hey, like, one, if you're thinking about dabbling with it, it's because you think it's possibly true. And if it is possibly true, you need to know all the facts about here's where all this can go. And so I want people to be aware of all the choice there, because the number of people who accept, A lot of people think this is ridiculous, but you know what? I get lots of emails every day from people who, again, I don't know these people, but they are coherent, well-written emails, maybe by AI, don't know, but still well-written. And they tell me stories about Ouija boards and experiences. And I mean, they line up, and the number of emails I've gotten from people say, you have just described what happened to me. No one believes me. Right. So
Yeah.
again, none of this is admissible in court as airtight.
No, but it's interesting. I mean, look, if you go on Amazon and you pull up the Ouija board and you look at the comments, and again, anybody can post a comment, anybody can make whatever they want to make up. But the point is, you go into those comments, and it's actually very stirring to read what people are writing in the Amazon comments on this product that you could buy as a board game. So there's just a lot there, and I want to just say before we round out to a close, because I have one more question for you about the show. I actually do find it, I'm going to use the word encouraging. I'm disturbed by those numbers with young people. From a Christian perspective, it shows me that what the Bible says is true. For me personally, that I see clearly people have an innate, want to connect with God. And so they're in a culture where culture is not really giving them that message anymore about God. If they're not going to church, they're not hearing it or seeing it, but they're attracted to find something bigger than themselves. Unfortunately, they're finding it in the occult, but it's actually a real opportunity for Christians and others to recognize that want is there and to meet people where they are and to talk about those dangers and all that. So I think that's amazing in some ways that we're actually watching that happen, and it's sort of exposing that truth. But at the end of the day, when all is said and done, because I know a lot of work, a lot of dedication went into the Exorcist Files, what are you hoping that people take away from this series?
I hope number one, everything I want, I want truth. I want freedom and truth. One of my favorite verses is where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And I absolutely desire freedom and flourishing for every human being. And this is a framework for people to explore and potentially liberate themselves, through this framework from something that may be holding them in bondage. So I want that. I love I love to tell stories, and I love to entertain. Right, so that's pretty easy when the subject is as horrific as exorcism. The stories need no exaggeration. They happen. I would say that. And then one of the things that I have learned over the years is that no matter how strongly one feels about the certainty, none of us are really 100% certain about anything. I mean, you get in your car, logically there's a chance you could have an accident, but you don't think about it, right? But still, that it's not 100% certain that you're going to get to any destination. You're also not 100%. I mean, if we really were 100% certain all the time of whatever it says in the Bible, our behavior would be different, right? We wouldn't fear a lot of things. We wouldn't panic, right? I mean, it's okay. Like I've learned to accept that, faith is simply holding a majority belief in the moment. You have to be, faith isn't, faith is 51% essentially, right? And so I want to meet people with a sense of like, look, like I could be totally wrong, right? There is so much about this world we don't understand. And I don't think it's helpful when people preach at people and say, I'm 100% sure that this is what's happening and this is where you're going if you don't do X, Y, and Z. Rather, I want to foster, and this is why I do in a couple of my other shows, is I want to create an environment where people can question, can ask things that sound ridiculous, and that we can meet each other with maybe 90% faith or confidence and say, look, I don't know. But to your point earlier about the earth, right? I don't know what's going on. I don't know why I'm born. I don't know why I have faculties. I don't know why I'm in this spinning ball of rock that is the perfect size, right? With the other perfect size small rock, the perfect distance from it, away from the perfect size ball of gas, right? Next to the biggest perfect size rocks to absorb all the impacts of all the others, right? All in the right time and place to make all this work. And that could all be coincidental. Absolutely. But it might not be. And so I want to just bring a humility to the discussion of faith and say, look, maybe demons are all hogwash, maybe spirits, maybe there's something else, right? But open your mind to the idea that there is more than the five senses. And to quote because he's on my desk here and I mentioned him earlier, but I love Dallas Willard, Divine Conspiracy, fantastic read. But he did a thought exercise for a lot of my friends in class, which was, is there a truth recognized beyond the five senses, right? Are there truths, right? And you get differing answers. And one of them is like, well, what's a thought? A thought can't taste, touch, feel it. You kind of see it, but not really. But like there is a truth of an immaterial world. And so I want to highlight that. And then I want people to draw their own conclusions. We try not to tell you what to believe. You can decide, but here's a humble priest in Michigan just telling a few crazy stories, and you can decide whether you think they're true or not. And hopefully that leads you to, some more freedom or just a different perspective on the world around you. But that's kind of my goal with this. I really don't like absolutism when it comes to talking about faith and science and stuff.
Well, Ryan, I so appreciate you taking the time coming on the show. Where can people go? Obviously, we know the main platforms. I don't know if there's another place you want to send them to hear the Exorcist Files.
So it's on all podcast platforms. You can visit our website at exorcistfiles.tv. You can watch the chilling trailer. You can also download on Apple, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, wherever you get your podcast. We do recommend a good set of headphones because we went to painstaking labor to create 3D binaural sound, which we didn't really get into, but it's nuts. It's a microphone with two little ears on it, and you move it around the room to actually have someone experience the audio of actually being in the room. So independent of the subject matter, I think it's a really cool auditory achievement. And my supervising producer, sound mixer, engineer, every title of audio, Chandler, who worked on this, did such a phenomenal job. It's worth listening to, even if you just I want binaural audio for everything now, so that's really cool. So definitely check it out. And then you can follow us at Instagram at at Exorcist Files, where we post responses. So if you have questions, Father does a little mailbag, and believe me, we get some weird ones, so you don't want to miss that.
Well, listen, appreciate your time. Thanks for coming on today.
No, thank you, appreciate it, man.